Moore. I'm the grants manager in the Research and Grants Center and the coordinator of IRB activities on campus. In case you are not aware, IRB is short for Institutional Review Board, and they are charged with ensuring protection of human subjects participating in research at ESU or participating in research being conducted by ESU, faculty, students, or staff. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to introduce the members of ESU's IRB that are here. So please stand when I read your name. Dr. John Barnett, he is not here right now. Dr. Mike Butler, Health, Physical Education, and Recreation. Dr. Kathy Ermler, Dean, Graduate School and Distance Education. Ms. Susan Hernandez, Educational Consultant, which is our community member. Dr. Pamela McDonald, current IRB Chair in the Department of Psychology. And Dr. Gary Wyatt, Sociology, Anthropology, and Cognitive Studies. He's not here either. I also want to introduce Ms. Jenny Barker, Administrative Assistant in the Research and Grants Center. We are pleased to welcome Ms. Stephanie Dyson Elms, the IRB Administrator for the University of Kansas Lawrence. She is responsible for ensuring the protection of human subjects participating in research that is affiliated with the University of Kansas, and she also works closely with the KU Medical Center, IRB. She's been in that position since 2011 and was previously a program analyst for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. She will be presenting information on the types of activities that qualify as human subject research, the types of research activities that require approval from the IRB, and the types of activities that are exempt. So I'll turn it over now to Stephanie. Do you want questions as you go along or at the end?
No questions throughout, fine. Hello everyone, thanks for coming. So I'm Stephanie Dyson Elms. I'm the IRB Administrator for KU Lawrence. Just to clarify, KU has 3 separate IRBs and 3 separate IRB staff offices. There's the medical center, has their own separate. They actually have 2 IRBs because they have so much medical, biomedical types of research to review. And Wichita also has their own IRB, separate staff, separate office. So this will be specific to Lawrence campus. We mostly do social, behavioral, and educational types of research. We do have a few biomedical types of things now and then from our pharmacy, school, and from our health, sport, and exercise science who likes to do leg biopsies and things like that. So, maybe. I'm pretty sure he's a...
There you go. There we go.
All right. So, this is going to talk a little bit about history, why we have IRBs, institutional review boards. I know some of you that are on the IRB will probably be familiar with this information, but if nothing else, it can just be a nice refresher for you. I'm going to go through some of the basic definitions. The regs are very specific to what human subjects are, what research is, what risk is, and those definitions don't always match up with the academic definitions for things like research. Scholarly research is not necessarily the same thing as the regulatory definition of research, and we find sometimes that can be a little bit of a mismatch at KU. And we'll talk about determinations, so exempt research, expedited, what the difference is, when you can do each of those, and a little bit more about the IRB, what the IRB does, their responsibilities. And I think throughout I'll talk about what we do at KU, which may sometimes be a little different from what goes on here. But I think if nothing else, just a little comparison can always be helpful. I should also mention we've made a lot of changes at KU in the last couple of years. We've switched to a new tutorial system about 2 years ago. We've switched to a completely online electronic management and submission system about 18 months ago, so we're still kind of transitioning to some extent there. What else? Oh, we have a new chair for our IRB about 2 years ago. And our previous chair stepped down after 17 years as our IRB chair. So we
Man. 16 years to go.
so we've really had a lot going on. So
Here at ESU, it's for life. So.
so 17 years is nothing.
My untimely demise, maybe.
Yeah. We love you.
So just a brief history. You're probably all somewhat familiar with this. But I'm sure you're all somewhat aware of research that happened that was not ethical. There's a variety of things from the Milgram studies on authority to Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the Stanford prison trials. All of these things happened, and over time it became clear that there was a need for some kind of oversight for research. I like to think of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was ongoing for a long time, but when all of that information came out in the 70s, it was kind of the last straw. Like that was really kind of we've got to do something about these problems. And you can see there they infected people with syphilis just to see what would happen. So that eventually, those investigations led to the National Research Act in 1974, which was an investigation kind of looking at where to go at a congressional level. And eventually that led to a draft of the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report is really kind of the basis for the regulations that we follow at 45 CFR 46. And this is more of an ethical, philosophical type of statement. So sometimes it can be difficult to translate these ideas into regulations, into procedures to follow to make sure that research is being conducted ethically. But these are the 3 pillars of the Belmont Report, and that's respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And as we go through a little bit of information about consent and some of the requirements, you can kind of see, in some places it's easier to see where the Belmont Report shows up in the regulations, and other times it's a little bit more of a stretch. But respect for persons is about, people are free people, they're autonomous, they should know what they're getting into. So really what we're looking at here is consent. Fully informed consent before someone's involved in research. Beneficence is about maximizing benefits and minimizing harms. So that's one of the big points at 46.111, which is all about looking at risks and making sure that they are acceptable, that the benefits and the risks associated with the research project have some kind of balance. And justice can mean both equitable selection of subjects and fair treatment. This one has kind of gone around a little bit as far as what it should mean. When we're talking about equitable selection, what they're really looking at there as that everyone that's involved in research should have the same access to the benefits, and everyone should also have the same potential. They should also accept the same risks. So you can't just pull subjects from one group and expect them to bear all the cost of conducting and participating in research, and then have another group that's going to benefit from that research that didn't also help in the actual research itself. So we don't deal with this too much because a lot of what we do is student projects with psychology studies or something like that. But really when you're looking at biomedical type of information where a lot of times you get paid to, to implant something in your body or take some kind of drug that's going to change the way your body works, there can be a lot of risk associated with that. And to make sure that there is not, some group, a low socioeconomic status group that's bearing all of the cost of the potential risks for that research, and that there's not some other group that's going to benefit. So it's just, again, kind of a balance. I think of the Belmont report a lot as kind of a rock, paper, scissors. You're trying to look at the differences, and it's all kind of a balancing act between those three pillars. So, and as I mentioned, 45 CFR 46 is the regulations that we all look at. I tell people at KU that they're really all out there and written down, and we're not making up things just to make life difficult for our researchers. Again, these really they've come out of the Belmont report. And the Belmont report is a little bit longer than what we've shown there, but it's only about 3 pages. It's not really an extensive document. The regs are pretty extensive, and like I said, sometimes you can really pick out in the regulations where things have come from the Belmont report, and other times it's a little more of a guessing game. But the regs are going to look at assuring compliance by research institutions, looking at obtaining and documenting informed consent, and there's also requirements for the IRB board, including makeup, reviews of research. We have definitions for all of the things that we do that I'll talk about a little bit here. Like I mentioned earlier, as far as human subjects and research, what's minimal risk, all of those things are defined according to the regulations. Any questions so far about history, Belmont report? No? So research can sometimes be a tough one. It seems like it would be a pretty simple definition, especially at an academic institution. But really, this definition does not always line up with kind of an academic or scholarly definition of research. So here it's a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Sometimes when we tell people that have applied that they're not doing human subjects research, most of the time it's because of this generalizable part. So we're looking at, is what they're doing, usually you can get systematic investigation. Most things that somebody's put any thought to at all can meet that definition. But what we're getting down to here with generalizable is it widely applicable? Can other people look at it and get some result out of it? Can repeat results? So this is why a lot of like oral histories are not considered human subjects research. Because, well, they might not meet a couple of those definitions. Things that are too small, if you only have like 1 or 2 participants, maybe your results are not going to be statistically significant, and it's not necessarily generalizable. This is also, like with everything we do, we try to think about it objectively, but it's also based on our own experiences and internal biases, and it's a reviewer that's looking at this and making this determination. Trying to think of what else we get a lot that's not human subjects research. Yes?
I'm probably jumping the gun with this question because you're probably going to address it, but I'm looking at this definition, I'm asking myself, is it more about design or the intent to produce generalizable knowledge, in the sense that classroom project, it may be designed in such a way that it could be generalizable, but perhaps your intent is to not go that route. So does it matter what your intent is, or just whether or not it's capable of being generalizable?
Guidance and other information, publications from OHRP really talk about intent for the research. So that's a good question, and that is really what we're looking at, is what is the goal, what is the intent? At KU, we don't usually consider classroom projects to be research, especially for like research methods classes, because the intent is to learn how to do research and turn in a paper at the end of it. And that's it. It's done, you get your grade, it never goes anywhere else. And that's the intent of the research. Compared to someone that's actually planning to, they may even be doing a similar study, but the plan is to write it up, to publish it, to get it out there among the community, and make it more generalizable that someone else did.
So regarding that, when the class is doing the research and they're turning the paper in, and they're also presenting at a research display sort of thing, as well as being encouraged to take photographs, then the intent is to disseminate that knowledge. So then it would meet this guideline, right?
Sure, it could. And this is, I don't want to complicate issues here. We, at KU, if it's a classroom project, we pretty much just say no.
Even if it's going to go beyond.
Most of the time, we haven't really found that actually happens. For undergraduate research, a lot. What we do have sometimes is, graduate level classes, they may do a classroom project, and then later on, they say, this was for my classroom project, but now I think I can use that data for my dissertation, and there's some mechanisms for that. But generally, if it's a classroom project, we try not to look at it. And a lot of times, like you said, that's also undergraduate work, just because it's just not likely to go anywhere. And I know there are some schools, Kentucky for one, they just don't review any undergraduate work at all. They don't consider any undergraduate work to be human subjects research. So this can really kind of vary wildly from place to place as to what you consider research, what your own institutional policies or procedures might be. We do a lot of undergraduate research at KU, so that would remove a large chunk of our applications if we didn't count those. But it's something to think about. Yes.
So I'm trying to understand this. If I have a class project and the students are going to do something like a survey or maybe interviews, they don't need to go through the IRB process?
Not
and the
necessarily.
informed consent forms?
We always recommend that people still use an informed consent process and conduct their research ethically. But if it's just a class project and that's the end of it, then we do not require IRB approval or application.
But if the same thing were to be done, the same interview, the same survey were to be done outside of the classroom, then we would need the IRB permission.
I think it would be more the intent. I'd look at the intent. So at Emporia State, a lot of our undergrads actually do a lot of presentations with their material. They carry it on to conferences, they carry it on to poster sessions, they carry it on to, they generalize it. They do it to a wider population. And so if in fact that's the intent of your classroom work, then I think you need IRB approval.
Sometimes what happens at the beginning of the
Just trying to get out of that.
At the beginning of the project, they're not looking ahead at the semester, but they come towards the end of the semester and they see how well they have done, and they want to really.
I guess I'll just make a comment here. I don't really understand why intent would matter. What would matter to me is whether somebody can be hurt or not. And if there's safeguards to protect that, they should be the primary concern, not whether or not we decide after the fact to present it in the paper or make a poster session. It seems like almost if we're not going to present it, if you're not careful, you could say, go ahead, do whatever you want.
Yes.
And,
That would be worth it.
yeah, so how do we, and I can also see though that if we really start to build undergraduate research here like we're thinking of, that a single IRB could be almost overwhelmed with all the proposals that come through. I imagine you would at KU when you have hundreds, thousands of them.
For classroom projects?
Yeah, for undergraduate projects and classes.
Yeah, I mean, really what you have to look at is intent.
Okay.
If the intent is to be generalizable, you know, and I guess we expect our students to have that idea at the beginning of the semester, like if they're going to use it for a class project, but then they also think they will carry on with something else, you know, that should be part of their research plan, and they should be able to tell us that when they apply.
It seems to me like here on campus, we should at least have the rule then that a classroom instructor would be morally obligated to review the projects and make sure no one's going to be hurt based on some standard, even if they don't go to IRB.
We would hope that would be happening.
And we would need to really, I think, articulate that.
That's something that we don't have a requirement, but we recommend to to research methods professors,
Right.
that they act as the IRB and they actually have their students fill out an application and go through the process, but they are the ones that review it. And a lot of times they can also give feedback, you know, because usually they do their own research as well, so they've had experience with IRB. Because the intent of those classes is to teach students how to do research and kind of the correct methods for going through there, not necessarily, you know, actually conducting generalizable research.
But actually, in my class, that's a main part of what I'm teaching them. So they do go through the IRB, and I would want to continue that, I would hope, even though it would make my workload a lot lighter. I just can't imagine teaching them, you could do a research project without getting approval, and you could do something unethical. I'm very concerned that would be an
Wouldn't it
issue.
be a problem down the line too for students, and I know you mentioned that the instructor could act as like a sort of a pseudo RP, but wouldn't it be a problem down the line if these students don't understand that process?
I know a lot of students, when they get to the graduate level, don't have that experience anyway, if they haven't done undergrad research.
Yeah, I mean, not all of our undergraduates necessarily do their own original research that would require IRB approval. I think that's kind of the purpose of having a faculty advisor in the graduate level that can guide them through these steps. I don't know that it's really been, I haven't noticed it being an issue that undergraduates, you know, may not have applied before. But there's only 2 people in our office, and like you were saying, if we reviewed every single potential IRB project that came through from every class, we'd need 25 people reviewing projects. So again, this is our specific to what we do. It may not necessarily fit with your university, but this is the definition, and generalizable, like I said, that specific word is really, can be a little bit controversial. You know, people interpret that differently from institution to institution. But I would think it's definitely something that it's good to think about and talk about and know what it means to your institution.
A legal question maybe you can address. And let's suppose I have a class, and I don't mean to be facetious in asking this, I have a class where the students are doing research and I review them personally. And I approve it, and somebody is hurt. Who gets sued?
You mean that you as a professor
Would I be the one who would be liable as opposed to the institution?
Well, you're going to be sued regardless.
I suppose that's
So
a
it's no
difference.
difference. It may affect your standing.
But if we went through the IRB, I imagine I would have some support because the process was followed, and we have a university attorney. If it's just me alone doing this, I would wonder.
I refer you to general counsel.
Yeah.
Okay. So research, we've talked a little bit about this. We get a lot of things at KU, like they're going to do a survey about how the dorms were this year, or how's food in the union, or things like that. And anything that's internal that really is just going back to whoever's doing it to make potentially make changes to their own policies or procedures or things like that. We don't consider them to meet that generalizable standard. Satisfaction surveys, did you like this class? I said class projects, undergraduate research, like I said, that one can be questionable. A lot of questions we get about public or de-identified data. We have a lot of people now that have access either from colleagues or other organizations or associations where they can get giant data sets. So the question is, we'll talk a little bit more about human subjects because that's the question there that it's going to be, is what, exactly what kind of data are you getting? Is that going to be human subjects research? Do you have a question?
No.
We also do, being close to Topeka, we do a lot of contract work. Some of our departments like social welfare and education, they have a lot of contracts with the state agencies, KDADS and KSDE, Health and Environment. And sometimes that depends on how the contract is actually written. But those sometimes, if they're doing work for them, doing some kind of analysis or evaluation or data sets, again, they're just looking at data and may not be interacting. But depending on how those contracts are written, they may also not be research according to this definition, because they almost fit into that like kind of internal survey. The data that they're coming up with is just going back to the agency, and then it's up to the agency to decide what happens with it from there. It's not the researcher that's disseminating the information or going in further with it.
But when the researcher is, in addition to it going back to the, then that changes the story. Yes.
Yeah, and that's usually all written into a contract as far as if they get to keep the data and can do their own research on it afterwards. So those are actually usually not too bad to figure out because it's going to be written into the contract if they have to return the data or what's going to happen to it afterwards.
There's a research that is not going to the public, but there's the IRB Fall. Does it have to go to
Well, this is, so as we go through here, kind of the steps that you go in order, you first have to decide if it's human subjects research. So does it meet, before you decide really even what the harm is, so as you're kind of looking through the decision tree, the first question is it human subjects research? So, is it a systematic investigation designed to produce generalizable knowledge? And then the second question will be, is it human subjects, which we're on now? Is that? So human subjects, again, this seems like it would be a pretty easy definition, like it's people. But it's not that easy because it's federal regulations. So it's a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual, or they have access to private identifiable information. So any deceased people, not human subjects. So if you're getting like old archives or something, even if they're fully identifiable but everyone is deceased, it's not human subjects. I suppose there still could be HIPAA involved there. An intervention or interaction, one of the big questions that we get is we have a lot of people that do online surveys using like MTurk through Amazon. I don't know if that's hit here yet, but that is like the biggest thing to hit our campus recently. So a lot of people wonder, if I'm doing an online survey and I'm not directly interacting with somebody, is that still human subjects research? I just put my survey out there, they can decide if they want to take it or not. So we get that question, and yes, it is human subjects. It does meet that definition. So we have this little chart. So the first question is, are you gathering information about living individuals? If it's no, no IRB review is required. So the next question is it intervention or interaction? Intervention can sometimes be a little bit tricky. I think the best example of that could be either there's been some studies where people look at things like test taking, and they don't really ever actually talk to the students. They consent them, they come in, and they'll have them take a test and maybe like change the temperature in the room, or they'll play music in the background, and they'll do things like that to see how those manipulations affect the test taking. Interaction is a little simpler. It's just communication with somebody. can be over the phone, over the internet, in person, any interaction. And if it's that, then it is human subjects. The second part of, is it individually identifiable information, and is it private? So there's a lot of confusion about public, individually identifiable information, and OHRP has clarified that the only type of information there would either be something that came from something like WikiLeaks, that's classified, it's been made public, that's public identifiable information, or something like state employee salaries, because those are made public through FOIA requests by different agencies every year. So normally that would be something that's considered to be private, but it's been made public, so that if you wanted to do some kind of research, you know, some analysis on state employee salaries, all of that information is available for an individually identifiable person. So it's not human subjects because it's publicly available. So that doesn't happen too often. So private information is something where an individual can reasonably expect that their information is going to stay private. So a lot of times, you know, that's medical information, academic records, things that are conducted, you know, through other research projects. Most of the stuff that we see. I talked earlier, I mentioned data sets. So that's something that we look at a lot. Can the individual's identity be ascertained through direct or indirect means? When we're looking at, we just had a project come through with like 36 million records. So it was, you know, there's just no way that the investigator would be able to tie back an individual to that information. So we said it wasn't human subjects research because of the size and because the basic identifiers have been taken off. I know there's a lot of new studies about people that are re-identifying participants in some survey that are supposed to be de-identified. I know that OHRP hasn't really addressed that at this point. So generally, you just kind of look and, you know, statistically, is it unlikely that this information could be easily re-identified? A lot of times we look at the size of the data set. If you have, you know, 5 records, then, you know, oh, 5 medical records, like maybe you could figure out like who that is based on, you know, whatever their medical history is. HIPAA has more specific requirements for whether or not things are considered to be de-identified. They have 18 identifiers that have to be removed from a data set. We don't run into real HIPAA stuff, covered stuff too much. So we just kind of look at this reasonable information. Like, is it reasonable to think that an investigator would be able to figure out who this is? Questions about human subjects?
Yeah.
Yes.
What if, so like that very first part where it's like it's about the individual, what if it's about their land?
Yeah, that would not be human subjects. Even though you are interacting with the person, if you're not asking questions about them, about the individual, it's not human subjects. Yeah, so if you're asking questions about organizations, or, you know, what is your organization's budget, and what is your organization's mission, or, you know, describe the land that you live on, or the land you farm. Those questions are not about the living individual, so they're not human subjects research.
And occasionally, you just go into the world and just watch people, at Walmart, at the mall, places like that. And it's part of an observational project, looking at parent-child interaction or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What does informed consent or IRB have to say about those kinds of things?
Generally, observations fall into one of the exempt categories, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So the consent requirements are not as strict, because exempt means they're exempt from the rest of the regulations, which includes consent. So those, they're also really considered to be less than then minimal risk, which I think is next. So we don't worry about it too much, I guess. So minimal risk, and this is again another definition from the regs. The probability and magnitude of harm anticipated in the research are not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life, or during performance of routine examinations like at the doctor's office or psychological testing. So this has a lot of different parts to it. So one of the things that we talk about a lot are probability and magnitude when we're looking at what the actual risk is. So we have some projects that come through that the probability of harm is really small, but if something did happen, it would be a really big deal. So that's different, I think, from something where the probability of harm is maybe likely, but the magnitude is very small. Somebody has a little bit of stress because you're asking, personal questions about, their sexual activities or, things like that. So just kind of, again, I think I said that the Belmont report was a lot like rock, paper, scissors. And again, this is kind of a balance between probability and magnitude of harm occurring.
So you could do something like, well, you might be hit by a car in this study, or you might not, but that's okay, because in real life, you might also get hit by a car.
Maybe
Like walking out to campus is a bit.
Your subject pool is like the Department of Transportation.
I have no idea why that would ever happen. I'm just wondering.
Their daily risk and their daily life for being hit by a car is a lot greater than someone normally. So maybe that would be something you could look at, a balance there. Because this is population specific. So if you're looking at, interviewing skydivers or something and you're asking them to do something, somebody that has 100 jumps in a year is probably they have a little bit more risk in their everyday life than, your average couch potato. So you have to also look at that, when you're talking about risk, is what's the population? What kind of risk do they normally assume throughout the course of their everyday life? And then a bit about the routine physical or psychological evaluations. That was kind of put in a little bit later just to kind of help clarify, because a lot of the research, especially from the psych department, is psychological evaluations of some kind. I think the survey we see the most often is the Beck Depression Inventory, and I think I have that one memorized. But things like that, they can be a little stressful, but it's not something that they would, more stressful than they might encounter, just by going to see a doctor or psychologist in the course of their everyday life.
Can I ask a question? We had one come to IRB, and it revolved around perceptions of pornography. How does that fit in your minimal or not minimal risks when you begin to talk about that?
So probably the first thing that I would want to know is if it was identifiable or if it was anonymous, and what the, how it was being conducted. So was it private? We had someone do a similar study where they just wanted to hand them out in classrooms, at the end of a class, which was a little questionable. But if it's anonymous, even if it is, risky to their privacy or their reputation, if it's completely anonymous and it's done in such a way that it stays confidential, thinking of a voting booth kind of setup where you can't see somebody's answers easily.
It was on the Amazon site.
On MTurk, and it was anonymous.
Yep.
I probably would think that has too much risk. Those are, that would be very difficult for an investigator or for anyone else to try and figure out who that person was based on their responses. And if you can do it in the privacy of your own home, where you know that no one else can see the responses that you're doing, I wouldn't think that would have too much risk. Yes?
Who gets to make the determination?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on how your IRB is set up. At KU, myself and the assistant coordinator are members of the board, and we're the designated reviewers. So we process everything except for full board review projects. We make the decision, all of these decisions we've seen so far, we make. And then we decide based on that information if it has to go to full board review or not.
Unless it's an undergraduate in the class.
Well, we would still make the decision about whether or not it's human subjects research, so that's included.
But only if they go to you.
Yeah, if you
Right.
said they don't go to you.
Right, if they don't apply,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it sounds like you get quite a bit of stuff that you might decide doesn't need to go through, but it goes to you nonetheless.
We get some. We do try to do a lot of training to help people figure out, what really needs to come to us or not. We encourage people to call us, if they're unsure about whether or not they need to apply. We get some. Maybe a couple a month that we say are not human subjects research for one reason or the other, and not just because it's a classroom
I
project.
guess the big question is if you have a teacher or researcher who decides to go through you and you decide it doesn't need to go, and everything's fine. But if they decide it doesn't need to go through you, but it really did, then you have a problem.
Potentially. I mean, really, I think that, and I'm not familiar with the type of undergraduate research that you do here. Most of what I've seen from our undergraduates would probably be exempt anyway, less than minimal risk kind of stuff. So, I don't know that it's really that risky what they're doing anyway.
I think I heard you say that there were two of you doing this determination. So did both of you come to this conclusion, or is it one person individually going to determine?
No, it's one person. We don't review
So
them
it's not
together.
interrated.
Yeah, we have too much volume for that.
Do we have one person making the determination?
Yeah, basically, I look at them and make a decision whether it goes to Pam. So is it human subjects or should it go through? And then I make a judgment on whether it goes exempt, expedited, or full. And then Pam takes it from there, and she can disagree with me at that point in time.
So any other questions about risk? The other thing about risk, when you're sending things to board, I think I talk about this later, but things that go to board, they have to fit either into these categories of, there's the determinations of exempt, expedited, and full board. And for both exempt and expedited research, there are very specific categories that the research has to fall into. So it has to be no greater than minimal risk and one of these specific categories. And if it's not, even if it's less likely to be less than minimal risk, if it doesn't fit into one of those categories, it still has to go to full board review. So those determinations are very specific according to the regs. So when you're looking at risk, this is the part of the regulations, it's the criteria for approval of research. And this first one up there, risks to subjects are minimized by using procedures which are consistent with sound research design and do not unnecessarily expose subjects to risk. So that's kind of the number one criteria for approval of research. We don't do peer reviews or anything like that, scientific reviews. At KUMC they do because of the nature of the biomedical types of research. You want to have another set of eyes on it that says, this is worthwhile research. It's a sound research design, those types of things. Most of what we do, like I said, is social behavioral. So it's a lot of surveys, interviews, questionnaires, and a few other things thrown in there. But most of the time, the sound research design part of it isn't something that really comes up too much. And you want to use procedures that are already being performed on subjects for diagnostic or treatment purposes. And again, that's a little more biomedical specific there. I think in here is the best place to kind of see the Belmont report and the regulations. So for number 1 there, number 2, risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. So this is where you're looking at weighing risks and benefits. And I think a lot of people tend to think that you can't have any risk with a study, but really what you're looking at is a balance of risk to benefit, not necessarily just removing all of the risk, but something to say that the benefits of this study are so great that even if there is some kind of risk, that it's worthwhile to do the study anyway because of the potential benefits for the study. So again, like a lot of things in the regs, it's kind of a balance, and that's based on whoever the reviewer is. So it can vary. Sometimes interpretations can be a little different. And I think generally places that do more high-risk research are not as risk averse because they see it all the time, they're used to looking at it. I know when we get studies that are, when our health, sport, and exercise science department first started doing all the leg biopsies, I understand that just caused quite a stir in the IRB, and now we see them and they're just kind of like, oh, here's another biopsy, you know. They're paying them $50. So all of these things, I think it's important to remember, can kind of, you know, they can vary from institution to institution. They can vary according to who's making the decisions and determinations. And what your institution is used to as far as looking at risk. Selection of subjects is equitable. Most of the time what we see is just, you know, Psych 101 student populations, you know, things like that. But you should, if you have something that's that has more risk or, you know, more potential to have an impact, we look at it more closely at the selection of subjects and who they're looking at and why they would want them to be involved in the research.
Does the vulnerable population absolutely require a full review?
Again, that probably is going to depend on your institution's policies. Until recently at KU, they required any research involving children to go to full board, kind of regardless of what they were doing. If there was children, it went to full board. And that's not a regulatory requirement. That's something additional that was added. Most of the time, that's not really adding any additional protection. We have a large school of education. People are always doing some little study in a classroom because they have pre-service and in-service requirements for their education teachers. So people would have to wait like 6 or 8 weeks to get this study back, and there's absolutely no risk to the study. You know, they're teaching children how to read better or doing some survey of lunchroom practices or something. There's no risk to those. So we've kind of gotten rid of that policy, and we've gone back to just the regulatory requirement.
And how do you view, if you had a study that had children and there was some risk involved, how do you view 17-year-olds?
Well, that's going to go by whatever the state statute is. So in Kansas, I think it's 18, and they can, I think it's in Missouri, you can make medical decisions at 16. So it really depends from, you know, state to state. If it's happening in Kansas, you know, compared to happening in Missouri, or if it's happening, you know, nationwide, that's something you have to take into account, is what the state requirements are for being a legal adult.
And so if you had 17-year-olds in the state of Kansas, you would have to get parental permission if they were doing a study.
Yes.
Yes.
There are, I didn't go over, there's specific subparts of the regulations for children, for prisoners, and for pregnant women. I didn't include that here because it's all very specific and I think outside of the scope here. But there are a whole set of regs specifically for children, and in Kansas that's 17 and under. There are other, in those regs there are some requirements, like if you think the children, you know, the child is being, you know, harmed, there's a potential, you know, where the parent would not allow the child to participate in the research because, you know, there's like child abuse or something going on and it would be beneficial for the child to be in the research. You might be able to waive that requirement regardless of the state statutes on minors. So there are some loopholes, I guess, for that. But generally, if it's surveys or just kind of basic kinds of research, it's whatever the state requirement is.
But who's, for children in the care of the state, whose permission do you get?
If they're wards of the state, it's whoever their legally authorized representative from the state is. Those regs, it's subpart D. There's also specific requirements with that if they are wards of the state about what kind of research you can conduct with those children. And they also have to have a representative that their only role is to look out for the welfare of the child, that also has to sign off on that type of research. So they get pretty specific with that kind of stuff. So here, one of the requirements, informed consent will be sought from each prospective subject or their legally authorized representative. Legally authorized representative can also vary by definition from state to state. Most of the time, that's anybody with a medical capacity. If you can, if you're a power of attorney for medical decisions or something like that. Most of the time, those kinds of populations know either who can sign for them, or we have people that do research a lot with like CLO or other groups for like developmentally disabled adults, and they live in homes. And most of the time, the administration there, they know who the contact is, who the legally authorized representative is, and a lot of times they can be helpful in figuring that out. Yes?
Back to children, is there any reason to require signature of the child in addition to their authorized representative or parent?
Assent is a requirement according to the regs. There is no requirement for a signature from the minor. But there needs to be some kind of assent process, and it depends on the age and the ability of the child to do so. So there's one of our groups does a lot of research with babies, 2 and under, and obviously those, they can't say, oh yeah, I want to participate in a research project. So what we want is some kind of decision tree from them about, how they'll determine, if the child is okay, like as long as they're not screaming or fussing, they seem happy enough. If they start crying, maybe they'll give them back to the parent to calm down and they'll try again. And if they're consistently, fussy and uncooperative, then, that's when they'll stop, doing the research. So it doesn't have to be a signature. It just has to be, whatever's appropriate for that age and ability level of the group. We have some people that submit really, really good stuff with decision trees and how many times they'll go back and kind of all of this stuff, and other people just kind of say, oh, well, we'll see what happens, and if they cry too much, we'll stop. So there's no really definitive requirements there. That's all the regs really say about assent, is that there should be an assent process. And you do have to get assent. So just because the parent says yes, if the kid absolutely says no, you can't ethically continue with the research according to the regs. So any of those ornery 17-year-olds can say no, and you have to let them out. Informed consent is appropriately documented. You have an adequate provision for monitoring the data collected to ensure safety. This is another one that's a little more specific to biomedical types of information. If they're getting, anesthesia, that's not necessarily part of like the actual research procedure, but someone is making sure that they're not getting too much anesthesia, or something like that would impact them negatively. There's actually somebody, a research participant, I think about 5 years ago, that died while they were doing, I don't remember what the procedure was, but they had, it was just Novocaine, and she kept complaining of pain, and they kept injecting her, and she ended up having an allergy, and she died. So this is kind of where that goes. It may not necessarily be specific to the actual procedure, but more of the overall health of the patient. And maintaining privacy of subjects and confidentiality of data. This is, for us, kind of one of the bigger issues that we see a lot, just because so much data is, out there online. People, how they're storing their data, how they're maintaining confidentiality, who's going to have access to it. Kind of the old standard was, I'm going to store this in a locked filing cabinet in my office. That doesn't really work in this day and age. I know KU has specific data classification and handling specifications according to our IT policies, and that's what we require people to follow. Most of the time, they're de-identifying data, or they're even getting something anonymous, like from MTurk or SONA, which is our site pool. So sometimes it's not that big of an issue. But if they're getting data, especially if they're getting like medical records, HIPAA data, FERPA academic records or something like that, we really are going to want to make sure that the privacy and confidentiality of participants is protected. And again, that's something, what you require there could depend on what your own, institutional policies are on data safety and privacy.
Do you look at all, while a person is doing the research, they say they maintain the data. Do you look at all for the data in the future? What happens after the research? How will they get rid of the data? How will they destroy it?
Yes. Most of the time people, they say whatever, most of the time what we see is whatever their field standard is. I think APA psychology is 7 years. So a lot of times that's what we see is they're going to store it in a de-identified way, and then after 7 years it'll be destroyed, according to whatever their requirements are.
Is that mandatory that after 7 years it has to be destroyed? Because if I want to do research on the same data from a different angle or perspective in the 8th year, what happens?
It depends on what you said in your consent form, what you've promised the participants that you're going to do with it. And it also depends on how it's being stored. If it's completely identifiable and it's private information, it's all there in one spreadsheet, we're going to look at that a lot more closely than we will if you've got a big anonymous data set, or you've de-identified all your data and you're storing it in different ways. Are you storing it on an encrypted server for KU, or have you said that you're storing it on your personal laptop? So we look at all of this kind of technical things to help us decide if we think you've done enough to protect the privacy and confidentiality. We don't have requirements. The regulatory requirement is that you have to keep everything for 3 years after the study ends. I found that most of the time other academic or kind of field standards, it's longer. But really, we just want to know what you're going to do with it. We currently don't have a post-approval monitoring process. That's probably going to be our next step, where we would actually go to somebody's lab and say, you said this is what you were doing. Let's see it so we can make sure that you're being compliant with what you've promised your participants and what you've said in your protocol.
So on the IRB consent form, I don't have to necessarily say that after 7 years I'm going to destroy this.
We generally require that. We want the researcher to tell people what they're doing with it, so they know what's happening to their data. Is it, if it's de-identified, if you say, I'm de-identifying it and I'm storing it indefinitely for future unspecified use, that's okay as long as you're told of that. Yes.
So, did you work with your IT to come to some mutually agreeable standard for electronic security, or are you deferring to their standards? I'm not clear.
Mostly we just want to know what they're planning to do. Like I said, as long as they keep it for the 3 years, that's our requirement. If they want to keep it for longer, that's fine, as long as they're telling us what they're doing. And
with regard to electronic security, did you say that they had to be in compliance with the university policy?
Yes.
And that's acceptable for IRB ranks?
Yes. Yeah, this is really about all the regs say about privacy and security. There's no like technical standards.
I mean, make a joke about the file cabinet, the old
Uh-huh.
school, these days it's all electronic.
Right,
But the regs don't speak to the specifics of the electronic security.
correct.
So you defer to the university's practice.
Yes. Because they're required to do that anyway. And here, after, I think it's kind of a weird place to put it, where they talk about coercion and undue influence as part of this adequate provisions to protect privacy and confidentiality. Most of the time, wherever we see any potential coercion or undue influence is if people, you know, it's with our biopsies again, like how much money are they paying students to do a biopsy? That kind of stuff. Like, are they, you know, what's standard? You know, are they paying them $200 to get them in there to do a biopsy? Like, that might be a little too much. Like, maybe that's a risk that they wouldn't normally take because it's the end of the semester and they want, you know, the money to get home. The other thing that we think about here is when we have graduate students doing projects, if they teach classes, if they're TAs, if they're recruiting their own students from their own classes to do surveys or something, you know, we kind of look at that and say, you know, how are you going to kind of separate those things and make sure that, you know, if so-and-so didn't want to participate in your study or maybe give you negative feedback on the survey that you did, that's not going to affect their grades, you know, if you're doing the grades. So usually we try to look for some separation some way, or anonymous surveys, or some way to kind of disconnect those two things so there won't be an impact from the research onto their grade in the class. Yes?
Do you look for more than just simply stating that they will not have any consequences if they don't participate? Do you look for something more specific than that?
Yes, I mean, we try to get some procedure out of them for how they're actually going to make sure that doesn't happen. Like I said, usually if we can get them to do some kind of anonymous survey, if they can get the, you know, if there's a faculty person that's in charge of all the sections that maybe collects the data, and then the graduate student gets it at the end of the semester after grades are in. You know, we look for some kind of protocol to protect from undue influence. You know what I mean? Really, you hope that people wouldn't allow that to affect their grades, but I think even, you know, unconsciously maybe that can be a bias that people have trouble with. So we just look for something.
Would you look for that for teachers in a school with working with children? Who, I'm a teacher, I have a built-in pool of parents say, okay, now they're my class. So now they have to sort of take it. Do you look for something that says, maybe I'm going to do it with a different class, not my own, or?
Yeah, it could also depend on what it is they're doing. If it's just like, a lot of times for that kind of stuff, it's just a basic like reading or math intervention. And, you know, maybe they don't want the whole class anyway. You know, they're doing a control and an experimental group and trying to see which one works better. You know, so it's not always an issue. But if just based on the research, you know, they have, you know, some kind of authority over the participants. We also see this with like employees and supervisors sometimes. And I think it also may depend on the, you know, if it's kindergartners, like, I don't know how worried you would be about, you know, the influence or what kind of action the teacher could take. You know, I think it's pass-fail anyway. But, you know, so it all, you know, I say this a lot, you know, it all kind of depends on the situation. I think potentially, you know, that could be a concern and, you know, and something to think about and definitely ask about, you know, how they're going to take precautions to make sure that doesn't affect the grade of the student. So I think we're getting into determinations here. We didn't do exempt at KU until about 2 years ago. We said we had our own more strict policies, so we only expedited and sent things to board review. So our researchers are still getting used to this, and this is the call we get all the time is, why doesn't it have an expiration date on the letter? But exempt is, it has to be in the no greater than minimal risk category, and it has to meet a specific category that it falls into, which I think I have listed next. People also really get confused about what exempt means. Some people think that it means exempt from anything, that they're the PI and they can make the decision that it's exempt and because they think it is. But really what it means is like the consent requirements don't apply, all of these other things, those criteria for approval, that those things really, we usually still think about them, but they're not requirements when it's exempt. And of course there's no continuing review requirement. Some schools, we currently do not have, we have not put our own expiration date. But I know some places they'll just have like a 3-year expiration and then it's over. And there's no continuing review, they just have to reapply. I've seen 3 years and 5 years. Some places like us, we just don't have, there's just no expiration date. Oh, that's small. So I'll just talk about these 3 that are bolded. The first one is research conducted in established or commonly accepted educational settings. So this is all the classroom research that goes on. Most of it's exempt. Doesn't matter if it involves children or adults, developmentally disabled people, any kind of population, it's fine. Research involving the use of educational tests, survey procedures, interview procedures, or observation of public behavior, as long as the information is de-identified, essentially, and doesn't place them at any additional risk. This is where we see a lot of stuff. We do a lot of surveys, a lot of interviews, some observation here and there. Usually it's combined with something else, but we have a lot of stuff in this exempt 2 category. And number 4 here is research involving the collection or study of existing data, documents, or records. That, again, it's de-identified data, or if the information is recorded by the investigator in such a way that subjects can't be identified. So if you're getting data from somewhere else and it's identifiable, but when you take it down, you de-identify it, then it can fit into this category. So we found these all to be very helpful. A lot of the research that people do, especially our student research, falls into these categories. There are obviously, other categories. My favorite here, and I've only got to use it one time, is number 6, which is taste and food quality evaluation. We just had somebody do a study of a cookie tasting, and I wanted to go observe that one. So that's exempt. They're really basic, less than minimal risk. Most of what we see, like I said, is classroom observation, educational testing, surveys, interviews, data that's de-identified. That's probably 50% of what we see at KU.
But exempt, they send it to you,
Yes.
and then you determine it's exempt?
Yes.
I just want to make sure that.
PIs, there's not a requirement in the regs for a designated reviewer to make the exempt determination, but it does say that PIs cannot make the decision themselves. Someone else has to do it, and at KU, that's us. So that one is, if you're looking at that policy, I would definitely, recommend looking at it carefully.
That's same here. When we tell people it may be exempt, you still have to send it to us,
Yeah.
and we'll make that determination.
And that's where I think the word exempt itself, a lot of people think it means like exempt from IRB review, I think, and that can be confusing. Yes. They're looking at redoing all of these regulations. That's been going on for a couple of years.
When I retire.
And a lot of the exempt stuff are things that they're looking at changing. The wording, just
Yes.
because calling it different things and changing how some of that goes. It's been going on since like 2011, so I doubt that it's like going to happen. I always tell people it could change. It's not going to be next semester, but yes.
But just to be clear, it's one thing for someone in IRB to say that's exempt, and it's a different thing for me to say, you know what, my students are doing class projects. My intent is to teach them how to do the research project. I don't intend these to go anywhere. Therefore, I'm not going to submit all these class projects to IRB. That's a different situation.
Right. That's the first in our decision tree. That's the first thing is it human subjects research? And after you've decided if it's human subjects research or not, then you decide, does it fit into this exempt category? So that's the second level. Yeah. So then we have expedited. Again, these are no greater than minimal risk research, and they have to fit into these categories. They also apply regardless of age of subjects, and again, this is where we had our additional procedures until a couple of years ago, where we sent all research with minors, even though it specifically says in these regulations that it's regardless of age. So it talks about the expedited review procedure cannot be used where identification of subjects or their responses could place them at risk of criminal or civil liability or be damaging to their financial standing, employability, reputation. So when you're looking at what the questions are at, so maybe this is like your pornography survey that could potentially be damaging to their reputation. So it's just trying to look at those additional risks. So it's not necessarily physical risks, but damage to a reputation or to their future employability or something like that. And it's just telling you that you should think about those things and think about the privacy and confidentiality. And if you can come to some kind of balance, then it can be expedited. You can't use it for classified research. I don't know if you guys do any of that. We don't currently. They're working on creating a classified facility on campus, so I'm not sure how that's going to affect us. But standard requirements for informed consent or its waiver apply to expedited projects. So they either have to still do a standard consent form or they have to request a waiver of informed consent. And then we have the categories. Again, these are small. All of this information is available, but most of these we don't see very often. So 1 and 2 is drugs and medical devices that aren't FDA regulated. Number 2 is blood sample. I think we've only used that like one time. Number 3 is collection of biological specimens by non-invasive means. So that could be like swabs or things like that. Collection of data through non-invasive procedures routinely employed in clinical practices. So these are like EEGs and ECGs and standard like height and weight and blood pressure and all of that kind of stuff.
So is there when I look at invasive, as soon as somebody says they're going to draw blood, I get a little nervous with the IRB. So is there a gauge to say you're only taking, it's only X or Y or Z and we're fine?
Yeah, for number 2, for the collection of blood samples, it has to be from healthy, non-pregnant adults who weigh at least 110 pounds, and the amounts drawn cannot exceed 550 milliliters in an 8-week period and cannot occur more frequently than 2 times a week.
Okay.
So generally, if it's outside that, if it doesn't fit, then it goes to full board, because it has to meet the specific category.
Do you have other additional guidelines for blood draws aside from this?
No, this is it for blood draws. This is actually, the expedited procedures are not part of the standard regulations. They're actually guidance from OHRP, but they're kind of commonly accepted as part of the regs, essentially.
I guess what I'm asking is, do you look for some sort of statements or assurances that the blood is going to be drawn in a particular way that's known to be safe or something along those lines.
You're not gonna use the same needle on everybody.
Well,
On
whatever.
the training.
I mean, are there some standards that you look for in terms of how they're going to collect that blood sample?
Most of the time when people do blood samples, they have phlebotomists that they say that in their protocol, that a trained phlebotomist will be the person that's actually collecting the blood draw, or it's, a doctor, an MD, as part of their clinical care practice, they're also doing blood draws. So usually it's pretty clear that they've got someone with appropriate training to do that. And if that's a question, then we ask them, like, who's doing it? Do they have training? What are their credentials?
I asked this question because it's come up several times here. And I've asked a lot of different people in different fields. And I'm told that every field has their own standard. There's not a universal standard. And I'm also told that I happen to be in the phys ed exercise science area. And I'm told that it's standard practice with us that if you've had some training, not necessarily a licensure or trained phlebotomist, but if you've had a particular training that qualifies you, and typically that appears to be acceptable for the kinds of draws that we do, but it may not be acceptable in another area. So
the regulations don't specify, what if there are credentials or anything else. I think the assumption is that you would have to reduce, for it to be less than minimal risk, it would have to be somebody that's trained and knows what they're doing to do so. I think it would probably, be okay for, an IRB to implement their own standards or requirements there if somebody's doing blood draws. Like, you're required, if you're doing blood draws, you're required to have a trained phlebotomist with this kind of certificate or training, or someone that's, whatever those might be.
and you wouldn't necessarily discriminate between a finger stick or a vein puncture.
The regulations don't, no. We really don't see blood draws that often. I think what we see a lot are swabs. They're looking for cortisol testing or something like that against whatever it is they're doing. There is more samples for collection of data through non-invasive means, because that does include swabs and things, and they get pretty specific on where the swabs can go and how far they can go to still be considered non-invasive. And I don't know if I agree with all of them, but there is a little more specific information in some places, but not all of them. I think that's part of the reason that they are looking at revamping some of these, because these would also be changed. Like I said, in some places there are more specific examples than others, and I think that seems reasonable to have some kind of standard for blood draws, but that's all it says in the regs. Number 5, research involving materials like data, documents, records, or specimens that have been collected or will be collected solely for non-research purposes. So a lot of times we see there like medical records. They've been collected for a medical purpose, and someone is doing a chart review or something like that. Number 7 is probably our most common one, which is pretty vague. Why a lot of things will fit into that category, which is research on individual or group characteristics or behavior, or research employing survey, interview, oral history, focus groups, program evaluation, or other things. Sometimes it's hard to determine if it fits into that exempt category 2 or expedited category 7. Those can be kind of questionable sometimes. And mostly what we look at there is, we do take into account that question at the beginning of the expedited category is if you're looking at any potential risks to reputation or employability. If the data you're collecting is completely anonymous, like an MTurk survey, kind of whatever it is you're asking about, we would normally exempt that in category 2. If they're collecting identifiable information, I think that would definitely go here in number 7, especially if it is, has any potential risk to it. Still no more than minimal risk, but if you think, that's kind of risky. And there's guidance from OHRP that kind of talks about, which one or the other. And again, this is really one of the things that the designated reviewer is going to make a determination about. And, it can vary a little bit depending on who's looking at it, what your institutional policies are, and all of those types of things. So board review is either greater than minimal risk, or it's no more than minimal risk, but it doesn't fit into one of those categories. That doesn't happen too often because most of the time you can shoehorn something into that category 7, but occasionally it does. We also look at deception studies. We have kind of our own policy and worksheet that we've made up to try to determine if deception is going to cause any additional risk. We see these in our psychology studies quite often. Are they just kind of omitting the hypothesis so they don't bias results, or are they purposefully trying to deceive the participants, either telling them actual false information or something that could potentially be harmful especially if they leave the study and might not get debriefed on what they've been told. So really what we look at there, we had one where people were confirming racist stereotypes. They said that they had, this organization had done research and, it was true that this group really was like that and this group was, whatever the stereotype was. And then they were asking people about their own stereotypes and biases. And we thought that if students, these young minds left thinking like, oh, they just confirmed, my own prejudices about this group or ethnicity, that could be harmful to them. So that one went to full board for review. What else did we have? We had them put some additional precautions in place. It was actually supposed to be an anonymous survey, and we actually made them collect identifiable information like their email address so that they could, even if they left, they could try to make sure that they were debriefed and informed that the study was had false information and it wasn't true. A lot of times vulnerable populations may require board review. Again, it's not necessarily a requirement for minors. Prisoners, I don't know if you all do any prisoner studies. And a lot of times with pregnant women, they have their own subpart B, and there's more specifications in there about what can go to full board or not. There's other, like developmentally disabled people they don't have their own subpart, they aren't necessarily considered to be a vulnerable population according to the regs. But a lot of people do consider them to have, more vulnerability, maybe more openness to, coercion or undue influence than your average person. So looking to make sure that those people are being protected. We see people with, dementia or, anything like that where it seems like, and again, it would depend on exactly what the study's doing and the risks, and again, it's a balance of those things, but it's something to think about when you're trying to decide if it can be expedited or not, like who the population is. And I mentioned deception. We don't always send deception to the board. That also used to be one of our rules. If there was any deception at all, it went to full board. But a lot of the deception we see is pretty benign. There's not really any additional risk to it. So we developed our own policy and a checklist to try to help us make a standard determination about what should go to the board or not for deception studies. The other determination that people have trouble with is engagement. And this is not part of the regulations at 45 CFR 46. This is guidance from OHRP. But it's really talking about when an institution is engaged in human subjects research. And we find this comes up a lot more with collaborative studies. We find more and more times that people are working with some other university or agency, or they've got people all over the country that are doing something, some part of their research. So we have to figure out if those people should be under our IRB, or if they should have their own, or if somebody has an analyst that works at another institution, is that person actually engaged in human subjects research, and who has responsibility for their role in that? And that's what engagement's all about. So essentially, if someone's interacting with participants for research purposes, if they have identifiable private information, or if they're obtaining informed consent from participants, then they're engaged in research. And you have to start thinking about collaboration, other IRBs. Is this person getting IRB approval? Should they be under your umbrella of IRB? And there's a couple of different options there, depending on who they are, what organization they're a part of, or they may not be a part of, for reliance agreements and individual investigator agreements. It's a whole nother ball game there, but it's definitely something to think about. We found with all of the collaborative research that's happening is, who's working on the study and are we responsible for them? And that's essentially what this engagement piece is about. So vulnerable subjects, I think I've mentioned a couple times the additional subparts to the regulations. So subpart B is pregnant women and fetuses. Subpart C is prisoners, and D is children. These apply when you are purposefully intending to have this population in your study. So if you're doing like a psych survey and a pregnant woman takes it, that doesn't necessarily mean that subpart B kicks in with all of the additional protections. This would be if your population for your study is pregnant women and that's your intent to study them. You do have to be an adult to do studies, so it's not quite the same for subpart D, because that's minor, so you can't just accidentally have a child in your study. And prisoners have a lot of specific rules about what's going to be in consent forms. There's additional requirements for board membership. If you're going to be involved in prisoner studies, you have to have a prisoner representative on the board. The consent form has to have specific information about that their parole is not going to be affected by participation and all of these things. Other groups I have down there, just as we talked a little bit about other vulnerable subjects and groups. So this isn't necessarily like every vulnerable group that you have to consider, because there are other groups that may need additional protection, but these have their own set of regulations. I was going to talk a little bit about just what we do at KU. I think I mentioned that we are designated reviewers, so we're part of the board. We've been designated as reviewers, so we make all of these determinations. If it's human subjects research, what determination category it fits into, the risk, all of those things. Most of our applications are exempt or expedited. We only send, we have monthly board meetings, and we send maybe like 3 to 5 projects to board every month. So we handle...
What's a typical turnaround time for a full board?
We tell people to give at least 6 to 8 weeks. We have requirements. It's like around the 15th of the month is the deadline, and then we meet the first Thursday of the month, so that we have plenty of time to get our agenda set and have everything in there.
So I might think that the actual board decisions are always made in an actual meeting.
Yes.
So it's not online.
No.
voting or anything like that?
No, there's guidance that says that it has to be in a convened meeting, and convened can include like conference calls or video conferencing, but it has, the decision should be made, the intent of the regulation is to be where people are together talking about things and making a decision.
That could be through Skype.
Yeah, I think there's some guidance out there, and that counts. I don't know if it was all on Skype, if that would be quite the same thing, if it was all just, everybody in their little boxes on the computer screen. I suppose that would work. I have to go back and look at that guidance, I guess. I think I've talked about all of this.
I just have one question about the
Sure.
80%. Will you be able to break it down further? Exempt would be approximately how much percent? Because we were wondering whether we even send it to you and stuff, and we know we have to.
Right, so we make determinations about exempt and expedited, so we still review and process all studies, even if they're exempt.
So I was just wondering what percentage of applications were exempt?
I'd say at least half of what we get is exempt. We have a lot of that is from psych. We have these psych pools. They're either using MTurk, they're doing anonymous online studies, or they're doing, the psych pool stuff, and it's either de-identified or anonymous. And they usually just run kind of the same scales, over and over, these batteries of psych tests, and all of those are exempt. This got small again. So this is just some basics about the membership. You have to have at least 5 members. The goal is to get a diverse group. You can't have all, one sex or one race. We even include usually a graduate student or 2 on our board, in addition to the other requirements, because we do, a lot of what we see is from our graduate students, so just to get that perspective as well. Scientific area, and at least 1 member whose primary concerns are in non-scientific areas. That one's pretty easy for us, since both myself and the coordinator are on the board, and we're non-scientific. My background is in public administration, so I do not consider myself to be a scientist. Someone that's not affiliated with the institution. For that person, we often try to get, we have 2 retired MDs on our board, and they also serve as our community member. And sometimes we do have, medical kinds of questions that come up, or some concern that they can help address those. So a lot of times we try to look for someone with kind of a dual purpose, I guess, on our board. We have, right now our board has 16 people, and we have alternates as well, so total it's 23. So we try to keep it from getting too out of control. If they have a conflict of interest, they should recuse themselves. Sometimes I find as an administrator that that's not always easy to help people understand that they have a conflict of interest. If they're reviewing a project from, the chair of their department, they don't always recognize that necessarily as a potential conflict of interest, but especially if they're a junior faculty member and it's their chair's project, you kind of have to remind people that that can be an issue. And of course, there's also always the option to invite a consultant to come if you have something that you don't normally discuss. This is from the standard part of the regs. I think I mentioned earlier, if you have prisoners, you do have to have a prisoner representative as well on the board. And just some of the IRB responsibilities. Making sure that all of the information for the IRB, we try to make it available on our website. We have our policies, our procedures, we have samples for consent forms, all of that kind of stuff is on our website. We try to encourage our board to participate, to think of their own things to do in their own departments. We've had someone that's held kind of a write-in for applications, that they have a goal and a mission on the board besides showing up once a month, that they should try to, promote education throughout their departments as they can. Did you have a question?
Yeah, sure did. Regarding, through the fourth bullet, perform quality assurance monitoring and research protocols. I know a lot of times I'll read a proposal and I'll think, I'll find something that I find to be questionable or disagreeable in the research protocol, but I feel like as an IRB committee member, I really need to limit my input to just the IRB aspect of it, and that makes it sound like you can go beyond that. Quality assurance of research protocols, or is that limited to strictly the regs?
I think that depends on your role. If you're looking at it as an IRB member, then it would just be the IRB, the regulatory aspects. If you're looking at it as a faculty member, that would probably be more inclusive, I would think. So it may just depend on how comfortable you are in mentoring, students or other faculty members. I know a lot of our faculty members that have been on the board for a long time, they regularly have people show up, other colleagues, come and ask them about specifics for projects or send them emails and things that they'd like assistance with.
So it sounds like in some cases, IRB's feedback is not limited to regs.
For an IRB decision, it's regulatory. I'm talking about kind of more of an outreach and education perspective. And sometimes quality assurance monitoring, I think often refers to a post-approval monitoring process. So that could depend on if you actually have that at your institution or not.
It mentions federal regulations, university policies, and IRBs. I would hate us to get into the practice of saying, well, this question here isn't very well written.
You go right ahead. If you want to do that.
Well, that's part of the scientific review part.
I'm
that we
just
talked
surprised
about
to
from
see
the
that word.
criteria.
That's not our role here. Ours is ethical.
Right,
Yeah.
unless it's so poorly, if there is risk and it's so poorly designed that it's going to cause
Right.
risk to the participants, right?
Sure, okay.
We see stuff all the time where it's like, this is not going to achieve anything worthwhile, but that's not our role as an IRB.
Right.
Some of this is not necessarily regulatory, this last slide. This is from a variety of sources, from guidance, from some publications. There's a surprising number of journal articles about IRBs and things out there. So this is just more of, what you can do as an IRB member and, thinking about, as an IRB member, other responsibilities like, informing and helping to educate, students and junior faculty members as you can. Yes?
Kind of as a leap from this conversation right here. So if part of the IRB process is to determine if there's more benefit, if it's more beneficial than there is, or a balance of being beneficial than there is risk to the individual, your personal determination of what benefit the research is going to have really is mute. Is that what, that's kind of what we're saying, other than
It can. We see a lot of studies, a lot of these graduate studies, these site studies, they're not going to have any benefit. They're not really going to come up with any, new knowledge to share with the field or answer any questions. But there's absolutely no risk except for, some of the participants' time. So, we really kind of just let those cancel out. It's really when there is risk that you want to think about the benefits and kind of look at that balance a little more carefully. I think that's it.
I have a question. I'm curious to see how you handle this when our students are using subjects from another institution. We require them to get approval from that other institution first before applying to us.
IRB approval or
Yes.
permission?
Either or. If it's a public school, we require them to have permission from the school. If it's another university, we require them to go through their IRB before they come to us. And normally that works out okay, except one instance we had a student who said, well, he said that to the other institution, but they required ours first before they would give him And so it's kind of, well,
That happens to us a lot, you know, because the Lawrence School District is pretty big, so a lot of people do research there, and they require researchers to have IRB approval from KU before they will grant permission to conduct research in their classrooms. So, and that's one of our requirements, is we say we want to see your permission or your IRB approval. So, and then they can't get either one, so the research is kind of stuck. So generally what we do there is say, we'll go ahead and approve it, but we write in their letter, you know, a statement that says like, you know, you're approved, but you cannot conduct research until you turn in this permission letter. And then we just add it to their file and they're good to go.
thank you very much.
My email address, if you have any questions, on our website and the regs there.
We will have the videotape posted on our website, and we'll let you know when that is,
What about the PowerPoint?
and the PowerPoint as well.
You referred to OHR quite a few times. I'm sorry, I probably should know.
The Office of Human Research Protections. It's under the Department of Health and Human Services. And they're the federal body that regulates all of this.